Hi everyone, welcome to week 6, video 6 already in the series in the book of Philippians. And you might be wondering what's going on here. Why does it look so different? Why is Curtis floating in space? And that's because today we're going to think about stars. When I think about stars in the Bible, it's hard for me not to remember the words of the psalmist in chapter 19, who said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands." And go on to say that through all the generation, to the very ends of the world, there's no place, no time where people couldn't look up and see the testimony of the stars declaring the greatness of the one who had created them. And just like those stars proclaim the glory of God, the Bible also teaches that the lives of those who trust God proclaim his glory. We are to shine like stars. That's certainly what Paul's going to say to the Philippian Christians in our passage for today, which you find in chapter 2, verses 12 to 30. So if you haven't already opened that up, please do so. Maybe you even have to hit pause. Go get it. Come back and join me. And of course, if anything's going to shine, it's usually going to shine against a dark backdrop, isn't it? And our dark backdrop as Christians is the world that we live in, a world of darkness. Paul calls it a crooked and depraved generation. That was certainly true 2,000 years ago in Philippi, and it's true even for us today. The language there is of perversion, distortion, something having veered off its intended purposes. It's crooked now. And that's the state of our world. It has been since sin entered into it, and perhaps we might even say increasingly so. But against that backdrop, we have the opportunity to shine. And so much so that the Old Testament prophets even said that when the Messiah would come and enter into our world, he would do so as light into darkness. The Apostle John picked up on that too when he spoke about the coming of Jesus into this world. When he taught about the incarnation, it was light coming into darkness. So much so that in chapter 3 we read, "This is the verdict. Lights come into the world, but men loved darkness instead of the light because their deeds were evil." The world didn't want to step into the light because it meant having to deal with all the darkness in their own heart and the consequences of their actions. And so here's the state in which Jesus came. A broken, crooked, depraved world that needed light. And you may recall too, when he ascended into heaven, he did so leaving us as his light in this world. His light shining in us and through us so that others may know him and comprehend him and join us in praising our Father in heaven. We famously read about this in the Sermon on the Mount he gave. Towards the beginning of it, he said, "You are the light of the world. And a city on a hill cannot be hid, and neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl." And this seems to be what Jesus would have had in mind back then. This was given to me by Neil and Virginia Lettinga, much loved friends of mine. Virginia said this was in her family's collection, and it dates all the way back to the 1st or 2nd century. And so this is what a little lamp would have looked like. And the idea here is that you'd cover this, and the thought was, why on earth would you cover it? Light's meant to shine. And so what I want to do is think about that picture. The Apostle Paul would even say to the church in Thessalonica, "You're sons of light, you're sons of day. Do not belong to night, do not belong to darkness." And as he finished the sentence here, he'd say, "Don't be like everyone else." And so the question I have for you then is, how do we end up hiding our light? How do we cover the lamp in such a way where the glory of God isn't seen in us? And there's obviously a lot of different answers to that. I'm only going to give you 4 obstacles that I think we find at the beginning of our section for today. The first obstacle I'll throw at you is disobedience. When we are not walking in obedience to God, we are hiding our light. We're putting it under a bowl. Paul makes this clear too in chapter 2, verse 12. He says we should be obeying much, much more. In verse 15, he says we're called to be pure and blameless as we hold out the word of life. And so when we're not repenting, when we're not confessing our sin and turning away from it, when we're not following the example of Jesus, living with the same attitude of Christ as we saw in the beginning of chapter 2, but instead when our lives are defined by selfishness and pride and jealousy, vanity, it's inevitably going to hide the life of Christ within us. Another thing we see in these verses, verse 14 in particular, is complaining. This might be a really timely one for us under quarantine. Grumbling, murmuring, muttering, that's the sense of the word. One commentary even likened it to a secret debate that's happening inside of us. A secret displeasure that isn't necessarily openly avowed, but it's just this inward disposition of, like ingratitude, lack of contentment, just being miserable, seeing all that isn't rather than what is. And where that ends up usually is the outward manifestation is arguing, it's division, it's hatred, it's discord in the church, a lack of harmony, a house divided. And when we live that way, if the church is going to be known by arguing and complaining and disobeying, well, no wonder our light doesn't shine, because as Paul said to the Christians in Thessalonica, we're just like everyone else. So there's a few things to begin with, and I'll give you one more way that we often hide our light, or we cover our lamp, if you will, and that's by withdrawing. And so we're just tempted to look at the world and say, it's so big, it's so bad, it's so evil, and have nothing to do with it. And we forget that the very heart of the Christian faith is the incarnation, Jesus coming into darkness as light. We now are sent as salt and light into our world. Both of those things permeate. That's by nature what they do. We're not meant to be sequestered away, afraid, but rather to be in the world, though not of it. That's why Paul says we live among those who live in darkness. Our lives in our workplaces, our communities, our neighborhoods are lived among those who are still in darkness. And when we hide from our world, we're hiding our light with it. We're hiding our testimonies to the glory of God. I like how John Stott says this in his book, The Living Church. It says, a lamp does no good if it's stowed in a cupboard, and salt does no good if it's stored in a salt cellar. Light must shine. Salt must soak. Both models illustrate the process of penetration and call us to permeate society. That too many of us hide away in our dark little cupboards or stay snug in our elegant little salt cellars. The house is dark at night. There's no sense blaming the house for its darkness. The question to ask is, where's the light? And again, if meat goes bad and becomes inedible, there's no sense blaming meat for its decay. The question to ask is, where is the salt? And so that's the thrust of this video. It's just asking you, where's your light shining? Is it shining? Are you putting yourself out there? Are you playing it safe? Or are you leaving unconfessed sin hanging around? Or perhaps through arguing and through complaining, you're hiding the lamp. You're concealing God's glory within you. It might be a handful of other things, or two handfuls of other things that we could add to our list, but I just wanted to get you thinking about these obstacles to our testimony. Maybe you'd say back, well, how can I make my light shine brighter then, Curtis? How can my lamp glow and blaze with the glory of God? And I think that answer is found in verse 12 and 13. Paul says to these Christians, work out your salvation, your own salvation, focus on yourself, with fear and trembling, for it's God who works in you to will and to work for his good pleasure. Did you catch that? You want your light to shine? You want to will and to work for his good pleasure? It's got to be God doing a work inside of you, and there's no shortcut for that. You've got to often be in the presence of the one who hung the stars. You've got to go to the one who is light, whose life is in you. And as you spend time with him, and as you hold fast to his word, as you open your life to the control of the Holy Spirit, and he has his way with you, more and more and more, that light is going to shine, and it's going to look like, love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, all the fruit of God's presence within you. And so here's the thing, it's not your light that needs to shine, it's His light through you as you die to yourself. The world doesn't need more Curtis Reimer. The world needs Jesus Christ bursting through the brokenness of Curtis Reimer as I become more and more and more like Him. And so I'm going to close with that picture that might be familiar to you of Moses way back in the Old Testament. You might recall when the law was given, he'd go and meet with God in the tent of meeting, and he'd leave the presence of God, and the refracted glory of God, you could say, was just blazing off his face. He shone, literally, so much so the people were freaked out and asked him to cover his face. He had been with the one who is light, and it was obvious to everyone. He had been in the presence of the one who hung the stars, and so he shone. And while our circumstances are different than Moses, I don't want to stretch that too much. All these years later, my hope is that we will shine right where He's placed us, that we would be who He set us free to be, that the world would see our good deeds, would see the way we live, the lack of complaining, the lack of arguing, the lack of disobedience to the kingdom of God. They'd see a life that's so different than this world, than the crooked and depraved generation in which we live. And they would join us in praising our Father in heaven. I pray that as we spend time in the presence of the one who hung the stars, that our lives, like stars, would pour forth speech day after day, night after night, proclaiming the goodness, the love, the beauty, the majesty of the one who made us for Himself. And so I hope that you will shine, and I hope that you'll join me on Wednesday, May 13th at 7 for a Zoom meeting. Details are here, or you can find them below. But let me say too, to those of you who have been watching the videos online and haven't come. Each week we have different people popping in, and it's such a great way to be encouraged, get to know other people, think through the verses together, and I hope that you'll be there this Wednesday. So may your little light shine. God bless.